I would like to tell you a story. Alone on an ocean tundra, wearing a protective clamshell-like parka and winter boots, I arduously move, exhale, and burrow through the afterlife of sexual violence. The medium of water, with its destructive potential and capacity to heal, in addition to the weight of an air tank with its promise of survival and threat of impending emptiness, hold the fullness of traumatic experience. In this silent psychic landscape, I bear witness to the complex nature of trauma and the ongoing process of healing. Trauma silences, it cuts us off from the world. Living with trauma can become bearable when survivors can share their experiences and have them be witnessed. Psychiatrist Judith Herman asserts that, quote, sharing the traumatic experience with others is a precondition for the restitution of a sense of a meaningful world, end quote. Yet trauma is difficult to express. According to psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, quote, even years later, traumatized people have enormous difficulty telling other people what happened to them. Their bodies re-experience terror, rage, and helplessness, as well as the impulse to fight or flee. But these feelings are almost impossible to articulate. Trauma by nature drives us to the edge of comprehension, cutting us off from language based on common experience or an imaginable past. End quote. Customary avenues for giving testimony, such as issuing a police statement or testifying in court, often present barriers that make it difficult for many survivors to fully articulate their experiences on and in their own terms. Art can elucidate felt experiences of trauma in visual, embodied ways that are not possible through spoken and written language alone. I am interested in how artists make use of their own bodies, or embodiment more broadly, to make visible, internal, often invisible, lived realities of violence and survival. How can artistic interventions expand our collective understanding of the impacts of sexual violence and trauma on survivors? Traumatic experience reconfigures relationships between self and world, opening up new perspectives, yielding new knowledge. How does it change us? What does it teach us? I come to these questions from my own experience of trauma resulting from sexual violence. In the weeks, months, years following, I became immobilized by a despair that cannot be translated into words. It pervaded all dimensions of my life. My world became an endless, timeless expanse over which I wandered alone. Today, all these years later, I am still transported to this site, where, at times, I traverse what feels like the bottom of the ocean. There is an assumption that justice will follow violence, and that in turn, recovery will follow justice, as though justice is a given and recovery a discernible thing with a discrete form and definitive endpoint. This has not been true for me. I have not seen justice served. Healing has been a fluid and ongoing project. Blue is the impact statement I was not permitted to give before the law. By means of somatic expression, visual metaphor, and editing strategies, it seeks to give form to my subjective experience, psychological and emotional impacts, and how they are registered in my body. Water is my collaborator, a nurturing and threatening force, supportive, receptive, restrictive, and different, a continuation of myself psychologically and materially. The violence perpetrated against me occurred near water. I was wearing golden clamshell earrings. The stranger ripped out the left valve. Several hours later, the police took the remaining one. The violence left me exposed, vulnerable, not unlike a shapeless mass of wet meat scraped from a shell. Afterward, I began to see shells everywhere. They would surface in embossed patterns on napkins. They would show up as small soaps in hotel washrooms. I would find them on coffee mugs and conversations and at the side of the road far from water. At first they seemed like siren song, luring me towards some bad place. With time, however, as I searched for meaning in senseless circumstances, they became amulets, guides. I followed the shells and was led to Hafrun, who has become a kind of kin with whom to think through violence in its many interconnected forms, as well as the limits of forensic evidentiary pursuits of knowledge. This is Hafrun, or rather, these are Hafrun's valves. She died in 2006 after being dredged from the coast of North Iceland, scraped from the seabed 262 feet beneath the surface, pulled up through water and into stark light. Hafrun, mystery of the ocean, the scientists named her. Arctica Icelandica clams, which fit snugly in the palm of a hand, are of interest to scientists as recorders of past climates. Information pertaining to environmental conditions are preserved in the growth rings of their shells. Back at the laboratory, to harness the data embedded in her body, Hafrun was dissected. First, they removed her soft tissue. Then, they unhinged her valves, encased them in clear blocks of resin, and sliced them into thin sections for observation under a microscope. Growth ring analysis revealed that at the time of her death, Hafrun was 507 years old. What do we know of this near-mythic creature archived as WG061294R? The specimen label featured in this photograph offers a thin contour of the circumstances surrounding her death. Part of a latitudinal coordinate, the weight of a valve. Some fields are left blank, and the label itself, about as detailed as a headstone, falls out of the frame. This data, though incomplete, tells one story. But data alone, if at all, surely cannot harness her essence. I wonder about the ineffable dimensions of her sprawling life. How might we have come to know Hafrun differently, relationally, with her? In Hafrun, I find a connection to the Icelandic women who, between 1618 and 1749, were executed by the national governing body at Þingvellir for convictions of adultery. They were drowned in Drakingárlur, the drowning pool. I wonder how many of these women had been raped. I imagine them, the 18 whose murders were recorded, the countless unnamed others, resting in sediment, like clams, at the bottom of this deep glacial pond. They have been there now for centuries. The clamshell-like parka that I wear in blue is designed after Hafrun. The growth rings of Hafrun's valves determined its pattern. It is made from over 200 pieces of fabric layered on top of one another, suggesting the secretion of shell, the accretion of growth rings. The shell is a protective entity, encasing the vulnerable parts of the clam. My parka, too, serves to protect my body, which is otherwise exposed. In combination with the winter boots, the parka recalls colder climates. The violence perpetrated against me occurred in a remote northern community, Churchill, Manitoba, Canada, located at the juncture of tundra and marine biomes. Of all places, it happened at the Iceberg Inn. A 1/24 scale replica of this building, sculpted from personal documentation, appears throughout blue. As I hold this replica in my arms or engage with the 3D printed figurine of myself fixed in the doorway, the Iceberg Inn becomes a kind of dollhouse. The enormity of this site and all that it represents can almost be grasped. From this vantage, I am better positioned to attend to my former self, who remains trapped in the doorway, between inside and outside, then and now, there and here. My somatic expression underwater was not predetermined. I did not make and execute a shot list. Rather, possibilities for movement, actions, gestures were explored and developed on site, guided by my body in collaboration with water. Over time, motifs developed, such as digging, resting, and wandering, which in some cases were then refined. It wasn't until the post-production editing process, spending time with the material, relating particular clips to one another, experimenting with ordering, that I sequenced blue. Well, the final work suggests I am alone on the seafloor, appearing isolated and vulnerable at times, self-sufficient and strong at others. In actuality, I was always underwater with two other people, dive master Fernando and underwater cinematographer Guy. Underwater production raised a number of challenges. In Blue, I do not wear goggles, which means that during production I was not able to see. My lack of vision, in addition to my inability to speak or hear underwater, made communication difficult and put me in a vulnerable position. In order to carry out production on the seafloor in a safe, efficient manner, we had to develop nonverbal communication strategies and map out plans above water. On the bottom of the ocean, without my voice, hearing, or sight, I seemed to lose sense of my place in the world. With little understanding of my orientation, I noticed myself retreating inward, inhabiting my body with increased awareness. This is interesting to me, given trauma survivors can often feel disconnected from their bodies. The ocean of blue is inspired by the frigid otherworldly depths of northern waters. The waters surrounding the site of my sexual assault, the drowning pool, Hafrun's habitat. For this reason, part of my research creation process involved returning to Churchill, Manitoba, to confront this place in all its complexity, to experience it anew, as well as visiting Iceland for the first time. In Churchill, I wandered the town and surrounding areas, revisiting sites associated with my trauma. I recorded this journey through photos, videos, and writing. I came to understand the act of wandering as a metaphor for the ongoing and circuitous experience of healing. In Iceland, I obtained my dry suit certification and visited the ocean bottom off the coast of North Iceland, where Hafrun remained burrowed for half of a millennium. I might have shot blue in Iceland, but for a number of logistical reasons, including cold temperatures, poor visibility, and cost, underwater video production was not feasible. Instead, I opted to bring form to blue in the waters surrounding Cozumel, Mexico. I have community here. It is where I learned how to scuba dive in the early days of my healing. My friends at Pelagic Venture Scuba, who I trusted and felt safe with, were willing to support Blue's production. Yet how does Cozumel figure into the final work? According to gender and cultural studies scholar Estrida Nemanis, quote, "A figuration must attend to its obligation towards the materiality, the matter from which it draws its metaphorical heft, and that within a critical materialist vein, evokes specific sets of contemporary questions." End quote. What are my responsibilities to the waters of Cozumel, Mexico that I work with in Blue, to the people and communities whose histories, presents, and futures are part of, perhaps inseparable from, these waters? As researchers and makers, as we work to work with rather than to take from, how can we mitigate tendencies toward extraction? How can we center care? Thank you.